Summer reached for her mother's hand as they stepped through the front door of the house they had lost 12 years earlier. It was the home where she had spent the first 15 years of her life with her parents before everything fell apart. Every room looked different, yet every corner still carried memories she had never forgotten. Instead of walking through the house, Summer headed straight upstairs to her old bedroom. She stopped in front of a section of the wall and gently brushed her fingers across the faded paint, hoping the previous owner had never noticed what had been hidden there. A small heart. Beneath it were 3 letters. M.S.N. Morgan, Summer, Nova. She rested her hand on the carving and slowly traced each letter one more time. Tears blurred her eyes as she looked up and whispered, "Dad, Mom and I are finally home. You can rest now." A few moments later, Summer walked back downstairs and took her mother's hand again. Together, they walked back toward the front door, knowing the house finally belonged to them again. "Today, your dad has a special gift for my 2 favorite girls." Morgan stepped through the front door carrying 2 small gift boxes, his suitcase still beside him after another business trip. Before he could even take off his jacket, Summer rushed across the living room and threw her arms around him. "Dad, you're finally home!" Morgan laughed and hugged his 15-year-old daughter. "Easy there. Let me breathe first." Nova walked out from the kitchen with a smile that always seemed to appear whenever she watched the 2 of them together. After so many years of marriage, nothing had changed. No matter how late Morgan came home or how tired he looked, Summer was always the first person waiting for him at the door. Morgan placed the 2 gift boxes on the dining table. "Go ahead. Open them." Summer reached for one immediately while Nova folded her arms. "What did you buy this time?" Summer lifted the lid and gasped. Inside lay a delicate silver ring with a small sapphire set in the center. Nova opened the second box and found another ring with the exact same design. She looked at Morgan, then back at the ring before letting out a helpless laugh. "Morgan, why do you keep spending money on things like this? We already have enough jewelry." She sounded as if she were scolding him, but her fingers had already slipped the ring onto her hand. She turned it under the light with an expression she couldn't quite hide. Summer was far less reserved. She hugged Morgan again before holding her hand in the air, admiring the ring from every angle. "I'm wearing this to school tomorrow. Everyone's going to see what my dad bought me," Morgan smiled. "Then your mom has to wear hers too. I can't let people think I have a favorite," Nova laughed. "You absolutely do." Morgan looked at the 2 people sitting across from him and nodded without hesitation. "You're right." He reached across the table and gently held one of Nova's hands while placing the other on Summer's shoulder. "I do have favorites," he smiled. "My 2 favorite girls." The room filled with laughter once again. To Summer and Nova, they were simply 2 beautiful rings from a husband and father returning home after another trip. None of them imagined that one day those small pieces of silver would become the last gifts Morgan would ever leave them. Morgan's life looked surprisingly simple for someone managing a private investment fund trusted by millions of dollars. He drove the same sedan for years because it still worked perfectly. He owned only a handful of watches, all inexpensive. Most mornings he wore plain business shirts that Nova usually bought for him because, left to himself, he would have kept wearing the old ones until they faded. Summer once asked why he never bought anything nice for himself. Morgan smiled as he adjusted his tie in front of the hallway mirror. "Because I already have everything I need." He wasn't trying to teach his daughter a lesson. He genuinely believed it. Fancy cars never interested him. Designer suits meant nothing to him. Every dollar he earned had already found a destination long before it reached his bank account. Summer's education, the mortgage, family vacations, home improvements, savings for the future. Morgan's world revolved around only 3 things: work, finance, family. At the office, he carried the responsibility of protecting other people's investments. The moment he returned home, that responsibility gave way to another one he valued even more: being a husband, being a father. Dinner was almost always eaten together. Weekend plans usually involved the backyard instead of business meetings. Unless something truly urgent happened, work stayed outside the front door. Many of Summer's friends rarely saw their fathers because work always came first. Morgan was different. He never promised to give Summer everything she wanted. He simply tried to be there whenever she needed him. That was enough to make Summer realize how fortunate she was. More than once, her classmates told her they wished their families were as close as hers. Summer always smiled when she heard that because she secretly thought the same thing. Looking back years later, she would realize those ordinary days had quietly become the happiest chapter of her life. And without knowing it, Morgan had already begun building the memory that would guide every important decision Summer made after he was gone. Saturday afternoons belonged to the backyard. As soon as lunch was over, Morgan rolled the barbecue grill beneath the wooden pergola he had built with his own hands a few years earlier. It wasn't the largest structure in the yard, nor the most expensive project he had ever paid for, but it was the place he loved most. Nearly every family celebration happened there. Birthdays, weekend dinners, quiet evenings with a pot of tea after long workdays. Summer carried plates from the kitchen while Nova prepared vegetables and salad. Morgan stood over the grill, turning steaks as the smell of charcoal drifted through the yard. "Don't steal one before dinner," he called after noticing Summer reaching toward the grill. Summer laughed and pulled her hand back. "I was just checking if they were ready." "That's exactly what you said last weekend." Once lunch was over, Morgan disappeared into the garage and returned carrying a tray of young flower plants, a shovel, and a pair of gardening gloves. Summer immediately recognized the routine. She slipped on the gloves without waiting to be asked. The flower beds surrounding the pergola had changed little over the years because Morgan cared for them almost every weekend. He loosened the soil before handing one of the plants to Summer. "Remember what comes first?" Summer nodded. "Don't squeeze the roots," Morgan smiled. "Right. If you damage the roots, the plant spends all its strength trying to survive instead of growing." Summer carefully lowered the flower into the soil while Morgan watched. "Good. Dad," she asked after a moment. "How do you know so much about plants?" Morgan brushed the dirt from his hands and looked around the garden. "Because every plant tells you what it needs," Summer frowned. "They don't talk," Morgan laughed. "No, but if you spend enough time paying attention, they don't have to." Summer wasn't sure she understood, but she remembered the sentence anyway. After finishing the last flower, Nova brought 3 cups of tea beneath the pergola. Morgan leaned back in his chair and looked around the backyard with quiet satisfaction. The flowers moved gently in the afternoon breeze while sunlight filtered through the wooden beams above them. "This," he said, lifting his cup slightly, "is still my favorite place in the whole world." Summer looked around the yard, trying to understand why her father loved this ordinary backyard so much. Years later, she finally would. Home had never been about the size of the house. It had always been about the people sitting beneath that pergola. Every weekday morning, Morgan left home a little before 8. By the time most of San Diego was settling into another workday, he was already inside the conference room of the private investment fund he had helped build over many years. His job wasn't simply choosing where to invest money. Hundreds of families had trusted the firm with their savings, retirement funds, and college accounts. Morgan never forgot that every number on a financial report represented someone's real life. While many fund managers searched for the highest returns, Morgan spent more time asking what could go wrong. Annual reports covered his desk. Industry research filled entire shelves in his office. If a company claimed its profits would double, Morgan wanted to know exactly how. If analysts predicted rapid growth, he looked for every reason they might be wrong. During investment meetings, his team often arrived excited about promising opportunities. Morgan usually listened without interrupting. When they finished, he asked the same question almost every time. "Now tell me why we shouldn't invest." The room often fell quiet. His analysts knew Morgan wasn't trying to criticize them. He simply believed an investment wasn't ready until every important risk had been challenged. That habit had protected the fund more than once. Clients trusted him because they knew he never chased quick profits. He preferred missing an opportunity over risking money he didn't fully understand. One colleague joked that Morgan could spend months researching a single company. Morgan only smiled. "If someone trusted me with their life savings, a few extra months isn't a long time." That mindset made him one of the most respected fund managers in the city. It also built a belief so deeply rooted that Morgan never questioned it anymore. He believed that if he researched enough, if he prepared enough, every risk could eventually be understood and controlled. For years, that belief had guided every successful decision he made. He had no reason to think it would ever fail him. Late one afternoon, one of Morgan's senior analysts knocked on his office door, carrying a thin folder. "I think this company deserves a look." Morgan accepted the folder and glanced at the cover. It belonged to a young artificial intelligence startup that very few people outside the industry had even heard of. There were no headlines calling it the next big thing, no famous founders giving interviews, and no investors rushing to buy into it. Most firms considered it too early and too risky. Morgan didn't reach a conclusion that day. He simply took the folder home. Over the following weeks, it rarely left his desk. He requested additional financial statements, compared revenue projections with signed contracts, studied customer retention reports, and spent hours reading technical documents that most fund managers would have ignored. Whenever he found something he didn't fully understand, he picked up the phone and called industry experts instead of relying on market opinions. Some nights, Nova walked into his home office long after midnight and found him surrounded by reports covered in handwritten notes. "You're still looking at that company?" she asked as she placed a cup of coffee beside him. Morgan smiled without lifting his eyes from the report. "The more I learn about it, the more I like it," Nova laughed softly. "You've been saying that for weeks." Morgan finally leaned back in his chair. "I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything." Nearly 3 months passed before he felt ready. The following morning, he gathered his investment team and spent almost 2 hours explaining every strength, every weakness, and every risk he had uncovered. By the end of the meeting, everyone understood one thing. If Morgan decided to invest, it wouldn't be because he was chasing a trend. It would be because he believed he had already looked at the opportunity from every possible angle. The fund began building its position little by little. Morgan never invested everything at once. Every new quarterly report was compared with the projections he had made months earlier. Quarter after quarter, the company continued delivering strong results. Revenue kept growing. New contracts were announced. More analysts began recommending the stock. Investors who had ignored the startup during its early days now wished they had paid attention sooner. Morgan reviewed every update with the same discipline that had guided him from the beginning. Each new report strengthened the conclusion he had already reached. He wasn't simply watching the company succeed. He was watching months of careful research prove itself right. As confidence continued growing, he approved increasing the fund's investment. Several longtime clients thanked him for recognizing an opportunity that most of the market had overlooked. Some even entrusted the fund with additional capital after seeing the results. That evening, Morgan arrived home carrying 3 cups of tea into the backyard. Summer was finishing her homework beneath the pergola while Nova watered the flowers nearby. Nova noticed the smile on his face before he spoke. "Looks like today went well," Morgan nodded. "A very good day." Summer looked up from her notebook with a grin. "Does that mean burgers this weekend?" Morgan laughed. "I think we've earned them." Summer raised both hands in celebration while Nova smiled and shook her head. The 3 of them sat beneath the pergola until the last light faded from the sky, talking about school, work, and what they wanted to plant next in the garden. None of them knew that the decision Morgan had made earlier that day would eventually become the beginning of the hardest chapter their family would ever face. For several more months, everything continued moving exactly as Morgan had expected. The startup expanded into new markets, signed new partnerships, and kept reporting strong financial results. Clients who had once questioned his decision were now praising his judgment. The investment had become one of the fund's strongest performers. Then one morning, a brief industry report caught Morgan's attention. One of the company's largest enterprise clients had delayed the rollout of a major contract. The market barely reacted. Most analysts dismissed it as a temporary setback. Morgan didn't. He reopened every report he had written over the previous months and began checking his assumptions one by one. At first, the differences were almost impossible to notice. Revenue was still growing, but not as quickly. Operating expenses had started climbing faster than expected. Cash reserves were shrinking little by little. None of those numbers alone suggested disaster, yet together they made him uneasy. Over the following weeks, more warning signs appeared. Another client postponed an expansion plan. A new round of funding took longer than expected. Industry experts who had once sounded confident suddenly became far more cautious. Morgan called everyone he trusted, searching for information that hadn't reached the market yet. Every conversation ended the same way. No one believed the company was in immediate danger, but no one could explain the growing uncertainty either. The reports on Morgan's desk became thicker than ever. He stayed at the office long after everyone else had gone home, checking the same numbers over and over, convinced there had to be something he was missing. For the first time in years, research was no longer giving him clearer answers. It was only raising more questions. The answers came far sooner than anyone expected. The company announced severe financial difficulties after failing to secure the funding it desperately needed. Within hours, panic spread through the market. Investors rushed to sell. Trading became chaotic. The stock price collapsed day after day until the company officially filed for bankruptcy protection. Years of growth disappeared almost overnight. Morgan stared at the news release on his computer without moving. Before he could finish reading it, his phone began ringing. Then another call came. And another. Clients wanted answers. Employees wanted instructions. Reporters asked for comments. By the end of the day, the conference room was filled with worried faces waiting for Morgan to tell them what to do next. There was no miracle left to find. The fund had suffered devastating losses. Morgan looked around the room before speaking. He didn't blame the market. He didn't blame the company. And he didn't try to protect himself. "This investment was my decision," he said. "The responsibility is mine." Over the following weeks, he met clients one after another, explaining exactly what had happened and answering every difficult question himself. Many were angry. Others were simply heartbroken. Morgan accepted every reaction because he believed they had earned that right. When the meetings ended, he quietly began selling everything he personally owned that wasn't essential for his family's daily life. Investment accounts were emptied. Savings disappeared. Every asset that could be converted into cash was sold. He wasn't trying to rebuild his career anymore. He was trying to reduce the losses carried by the people who had trusted him. Even after giving up almost everything he had, the remaining obligations still couldn't be covered. One evening, Morgan sat alone in his office, staring at the final balance sheet. He checked the numbers one last time before slowly closing the file. For the first time in his career, he had reached a problem that preparation, discipline, and hard work could no longer solve. The following afternoon, Morgan called Harry and asked if they could meet. They had known each other since college, long before either of them became successful. Harry had built a lighting company from the ground up, while Morgan had built his career in finance. Although life had taken them down different paths, they had remained friends for many years. Morgan didn't waste time explaining things that Harry already knew. The collapse of the fund had made local business news. He went straight to the point. "I need $50,000. Harry remained silent for a few seconds before asking, "Can you pay it back?" Morgan answered honestly, "I believe I can. I just need time." Harry studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll lend it to you." Morgan let out a slow breath. "Thank you." Harry slid a loan agreement across the table. "Business is business, Morgan. I know you'll understand." Morgan read through the document before signing his name. As he stood to leave, Harry said one more thing. "I hope you get through this." Morgan nodded and walked away with the money that represented the last chance to keep everything from falling apart. Over the following months, he fought harder than ever. He searched for new opportunities, met with creditors, negotiated repayment plans, and continued selling whatever assets remained. Every dollar he managed to recover immediately went toward the people he still owed. He refused to disappear and leave others carrying the consequences of his decisions. But no matter how hard he worked, the numbers refused to change. When the repayment deadline finally arrived, Morgan returned to Harry's office. "I need more time." Harry slowly shook his head. "I've already waited as long as I can." Morgan lowered his voice. "Please." Harry leaned back in his chair before sliding another folder across the desk. "Then sell me your house." Morgan didn't reach for the folder. Harry continued, speaking in the same calm tone he used during any business negotiation. "The property's worth around $500,000. I'll buy it for $430,000. He paused for a moment before adding, $30,000 will count toward the loan. We'll settle the rest at closing." Morgan already knew the offer was well below market value. He also knew he no longer had another option. After a long silence, he finally picked up the folder. Moving day arrived under a clear California sky. Cardboard boxes filled every room of the house. The walls that had once displayed family photographs were bare, leaving behind lighter patches where the frames had hung for years. Summer carried another box downstairs before stopping halfway across the living room. She slowly turned in a circle, taking in every corner as though she were afraid she might forget it someday. Upstairs, her bedroom no longer looked like the place where she had grown up. The bookshelf Morgan had built for her stood empty. The closet doors were open. Even the sound of her footsteps felt different now that the room had been stripped of everything that had made it hers. She walked from room to room one last time, running her fingertips lightly across the walls before quietly closing the bedroom door. Outside, the moving truck was almost ready to leave. Nova loaded the final box into the back while Morgan remained in the backyard. He stood beneath the pergola without moving, his hand resting against one of the wooden posts he had sanded and assembled with his own hands years earlier. The flower beds surrounding it were in full bloom. Roses, lavender, daisies. Every plant had been placed there one weekend at a time, with Summer kneeling beside him, learning how to loosen the soil without damaging the roots. Morgan looked across the garden for a long time. He wasn't trying to memorize the flowers. He already knew every corner by heart. He was saying goodbye to the dream he had spent years building. When Summer stepped into the backyard, she found him still standing there. Neither of them spoke. She simply walked over and slipped her hand into his. After a quiet moment, Morgan gave her hand a gentle squeeze before turning toward the house. He looked back one final time, then climbed into the moving truck with his family and watched the only home Summer had ever known slowly disappear behind them. The apartment they rented was less than half the size of their old home. The living room was small enough that several boxes had to remain stacked against one wall because there was nowhere else to put them. There was no backyard, no pergola, no place for flowers. Everything felt temporary. That evening, Nova made a simple dinner using whatever they had managed to unpack. When they finished eating, Summer carried 3 cups of tea onto the narrow balcony almost without thinking. The space was barely wide enough for 3 chairs, but she placed them side by side anyway. Morgan stepped outside a few moments later and quietly sat down beside his daughter. Nova joined them, and for a while, none of them said anything. The city lights flickered beyond the apartment buildings while traffic drifted up from the street below. Finally, Morgan broke the silence. "I'm sorry." Summer immediately looked at him. "Dad," Morgan slowly shook his head. "I kept believing that if I worked hard enough, if I prepared carefully enough, I could protect this family from anything." He looked down at the cup, warming his hands before forcing a small smile. "Looks like I was wrong." Nova reached over and held his hand. "You gave us everything you had." Morgan squeezed her hand gently before turning to Summer. His eyes rested on his daughter for several long seconds. "There's only one thing I wish I could have done differently." Summer waited quietly. Morgan looked toward the dark sky beyond the balcony. "I only wish our home was still there." His voice grew softer. "So no matter where life took the two of you, your mom and you would always have a place to come home to." Summer felt tears gathering in her eyes. She reached across the small table and held her father's hand tightly. "I promise I'll always take care of Mom." Morgan smiled, the same warm smile Summer had known since she was little. "I know you will." A few months later, Morgan suffered a sudden heart attack and passed away peacefully. He left behind no successful investment fund, no fortune, and no family home. What remained was one unfinished promise, and a 15-year-old girl who would spend the next 12 years trying to fulfill it. Morgan's funeral ended, but life didn't stop with it. One by one, relatives returned to their own homes. Former colleagues gradually stopped visiting. The flowers placed outside the apartment door disappeared after a few days, leaving the quiet behind. For the first time in her life, Summer realized there would never be another evening when she heard her father's car pulling into the parking lot. The apartment slowly settled into a new routine with only 2 people. Every morning, Nova still woke up before sunrise out of habit. More than once, she prepared 3 plates before stopping halfway and putting one back into the cabinet. She never said anything when it happened. Summer never pointed it out either. Some mornings, silence was kinder than words. A week after the funeral, Nova spread every remaining document across the dining table: bank statements, loan agreements, medical bills, utility payments. Summer sat beside her, sorting each stack into order. Morgan had done everything he could to repay the investors who had trusted him, but several personal debts still remained. The total wasn't impossible, yet it was overwhelming for a housewife with no career and a 15-year-old girl who had just lost her father. Nova slowly closed the final folder. "We'll pay every dollar." Summer looked at the papers, then at the framed photograph of Morgan sitting on a small shelf nearby. "We'll finish what Dad started." Neither of them knew how long it would take. They only knew quitting had never been part of Morgan's way of living. They weren't about to begin now. Several days later, Nova opened the top drawer of a small dresser beside her bed and carefully placed two familiar boxes on the table. Summer recognized them immediately. They were the matching rings Morgan had brought home after his last business trip. For a long moment, neither of them reached for the boxes. Nova finally opened the first one and gently traced the silver band with her fingertip. "Your dad spent nearly an hour choosing these," she said with a faint smile. He kept asking the salesperson which design would look better on the two women he loved most. Summer lowered her eyes to the second ring. She remembered running to school the next morning, proudly showing it to every friend who asked where it had come from. Back then, she had thought she would wear it for the rest of her life. Nova quietly closed both boxes. She didn't explain what they had to do next because there was nothing left to explain. Summer simply nodded. They drove to a neighborhood jewelry store that afternoon. The owner examined both rings carefully before writing an offer on a small slip of paper and placing it on the counter. Summer never looked at the number. She picked up her ring one final time and held it tightly in her palm. She could almost hear Morgan laughing as he called her one of his two favorite girls. After several silent seconds, she opened her hand and placed the ring back onto the glass display. "We'll sell them." The jeweler completed the paperwork and handed Nova an envelope containing the payment. On the drive home, Summer rested her hand on her lap and unconsciously rubbed the finger where the ring had once been. It felt strangely light. Neither she nor Nova spoke during the drive. They both knew they hadn't just sold two rings. They had sold the last gifts Morgan had ever given them. The money from the rings helped them get through the next few weeks, but it was never going to change their future. If they wanted to pay off every remaining debt, they needed steady income, not one-time solutions. Nova had spent most of her adult life taking care of her family. Now, at 38, she had to enter the workforce with no recent job experience. She accepted the first position she could find as a dishwasher at a small family restaurant. The work was exhausting. She stood for hours beside steaming sinks, scrubbing dishes until her hands became rough and sore. When the restaurant closed each night, she returned home smelling of soap and hot water. A few weeks later, she took a second job cleaning houses during the day whenever she wasn't scheduled at the restaurant. Summer watched her mother leave before sunrise and come home after dark, yet she never once heard Nova complain. Summer couldn't stand by and watch. She continued going to school every morning, then found part-time work after classes. She stocked shelves at a neighborhood grocery store on weekdays and picked up extra shifts whenever school was out. Their schedules rarely matched anymore. Some evenings, Summer arrived home just as Nova was getting ready to leave for the restaurant. They ate simple meals whenever they happened to be in the apartment at the same time. Life became a cycle of school, work, sleep, and bills. It wasn't the life either of them had imagined, but every paycheck moved them one step closer to keeping the promise they had made in front of Morgan's photograph. One evening, Summer came home carrying a few crumpled dollar bills she had earned in tips after helping a customer load groceries into a car. She placed the money on the table and pushed it toward Nova. "Use this for the bills." Nova looked at the small pile of cash before walking to a kitchen cabinet. She returned holding a large empty glass jar and placed it in the middle of the table. "From today on," she said, setting the lid beside it, "every tip goes in here." Summer looked at the jar, then back at her mother. "What are we saving for?" Nova dropped the first bill into the jar. The soft sound echoed through the quiet apartment. She smiled gently. "To finish what your dad couldn't?" Summer didn't ask another question. She picked up the rest of the bills and slipped them into the jar one by one. The amount inside was so small it barely covered the bottom of the glass, yet both of them smiled when they looked at it. It wasn't much money. It was a beginning. From that day forward, the jar became part of their routine. Whenever Summer earned tips, she dropped them inside before doing anything else. Some nights, after Summer had gone to bed, Nova quietly opened her purse and added a few folded bills of her own. She never mentioned it the next morning. Summer believed the jar was filling because of her tips alone. Nova preferred to keep it that way. To her, it wasn't important who contributed more. What mattered was that every dollar carried them closer to the day Morgan would no longer have to worry about the debts he had left behind. The glass jar filled far more slowly than either of them wished. Some weeks, only a few dollar bills found their way inside. Other weeks, they couldn't add anything at all because an unexpected expense had emptied their wallets before payday. Still, the jar remained on the kitchen counter, quietly reminding them why they kept working. Months turned into years. Summer grew taller, finished high school, and continued balancing work with her studies. Nova kept moving between the restaurant and cleaning jobs, leaving home before sunrise and returning long after dark. Neither of them counted the money inside the jar. They simply kept adding to it whenever they could. Summer never noticed that the amount inside seemed to grow faster than her tips alone could explain. Whenever she wasn't looking, Nova slipped in a few folded bills from her own paycheck. Sometimes it was $5, sometimes $20. Occasionally, after working an extra cleaning job, she added $50. She never expected Summer to find out. The jar wasn't about proving who had sacrificed more. It represented something they were building together, $1 at a time. Although life remained difficult, one thing slowly began to change. The debts became smaller every month. The balance that had once looked impossible gradually started looking manageable. For the first time since Morgan passed away, the future no longer felt completely out of reach. Almost 2 years after placing the first dollar into the glass jar, Summer carried it onto the dining table. It had become surprisingly heavy. Nova brought out a notebook, a calculator, and every remaining debt statement they still owed. Summer unscrewed the lid and poured the money across the table. Dollar bills, $5 bills, and handfuls of coins spread across the wood. They spent nearly an hour counting everything together before comparing the total with the remaining balance on the final debt. Summer looked at the calculator, then looked at her mother again. "We have enough," neither of them cheered. Nova simply closed her eyes for a brief moment before smiling. Within the following days, they made the final payment. When the receipt arrived, confirming every remaining personal debt had been cleared, Nova carefully placed it inside the same folder that had once held Morgan's unpaid bills. After everything was finished, they counted the money left over. A little more than $300 remained. Summer smiled. "What should we do with it?" Nova didn't answer immediately. Her eyes stopped at a small barbecue grill displayed outside a hardware store they happened to pass on the way home. She stood there for a few seconds before saying softly, "Your dad always wanted one like that for the apartment." Summer smiled. "Then let's buy it." That weekend, the two of them carried the small grill onto the apartment balcony. They cooked hamburgers, poured 3 cups of tea out of habit, and placed them on the little table. For a moment, Summer looked at the empty chair beside them before lifting her cup with a quiet smile. The balcony was nothing like the pergola behind their old home, but as she looked at her mother across the table, she realized something Morgan had always believed. Home was never just a place. It was the people who shared it with you. Life became steadier after the last debt was paid, but one habit never left Summer. Whenever she happened to be in the neighborhood, she found herself driving past the house where she had spent the first 15 years of her life. She never parked in front of it for long. She never knocked on the door. She never tried to speak with Harry or anyone inside. She simply slowed the car as she passed and looked at the place that had never really disappeared from her heart. At first, almost nothing changed. The same white fence, the same roof, the same pergola standing quietly in the backyard. Then, as the years passed, small differences began to appear. The front door was replaced. New windows were installed. New windows were installed. One afternoon, Summer noticed something that made her grip the steering wheel a little tighter. The flower beds Morgan had spent years caring for were gone. The roses had disappeared. The lavender no longer lined the walkway. Even the daisies along the fence had been removed. Someone had redesigned the garden to make it easier to maintain. Summer remained parked across the street for several minutes before driving away. She wasn't upset with the new owner. People had every right to make a house their own. Even so, she found herself remembering exactly where every flower had once been. She could still picture Morgan kneeling in the soil, showing her how to loosen the roots before planting. 12 years had not erased a single detail. Life gradually settled into a routine again, but something had quietly changed inside Summer. Every time she drove through a neighborhood or finished meeting a client, she found herself noticing details she had never paid attention to before. One house attracted several offers within days. Another sat on the market for months without a single serious buyer. 2 homes with almost identical layouts sold for completely different prices. She couldn't stop wondering why. Was it the location? The timing? The condition of the property? Or were families looking for something that couldn't be measured on a listing sheet? Those questions followed her home every evening. Instead of relaxing after work, she began reading about the housing market. She learned how interest rates influenced demand, why some neighborhoods appreciated faster than others, and how buyers decided what a home was truly worth. The more she learned, the more she realized real estate wasn't just about numbers. Every sale represented a family making one of the biggest decisions of their lives. That thought stayed with her long after she closed each book, and before she realized it, curiosity had become a passion she wanted to pursue. Once Summer decided to learn about real estate, she treated it the same way Morgan had approached every investment. She refused to rely on headlines or quick opinions. Every evening after work, she opened another book. On weekends, she attended open houses across San Diego, not because she planned to buy a home, but because she wanted to understand how the business actually worked. She watched how experienced realtors greeted buyers, how they answered difficult questions, and how they guided families through each property. When she didn't understand a legal term or a financing process, she stayed up until she found the answer. She compared listing prices with final selling prices, studied neighborhood trends, and read inspection reports simply to understand what separated a good home from a bad investment. Months later, she enrolled in the courses required to earn her real estate license. She kept working during the day and studied late into the night, often falling asleep with textbooks still open beside her. Passing the licensing exam felt rewarding, but Summer never saw it as the finish line. To her, it was simply the beginning of a career she still had to prove she deserved. Summer entered the industry believing that hard work alone would be enough. Reality proved otherwise. Her first few months were filled with disappointment. Buyers canceled appointments without explanation. Some thanked her for spending weeks helping them search, then purchased a house through another agent. Others decided to postpone moving altogether after unexpected changes in their lives. Every lost deal hurt because she knew how much time she had invested. Instead of blaming the clients or the market, Summer reviewed every meeting once she got home. She asked herself the same question after each setback. What could I have done better? Sometimes she realized she had talked too much. Other times, she understood she had focused on the property instead of the people standing inside it. Little by little, those mistakes changed the way she worked. She stopped trying to convince buyers that a house was worth purchasing. Instead, she tried to understand why they were searching in the first place. The more she listened, the more she realized every family was chasing something different. A shorter commute, better schools, a safer neighborhood, a fresh start after divorce, a place where children could grow up close to their grandparents. Houses were only part of the conversation. The people living inside them mattered far more. As the months passed, Summer slowly built her own way of working. Instead of beginning every appointment with questions about budgets or square footage, she started with something much simpler. Tell me about your family. At first, many buyers looked surprised. Then they began talking. They spoke about children who needed a backyard to play in, parents who would soon move in with them, a new baby arriving in a few months, or the long commute they hoped to leave behind. Summer listened carefully and rarely interrupted. By the time they finished, she usually understood far more than any checklist could have told her. That changed the way she showed homes. She no longer tried to impress buyers with expensive finishes or beautiful kitchens. Instead, she paid attention to their reactions, which room they stayed in the longest, which window they kept walking back to, whether their children smiled the moment they saw the backyard. Those quiet moments often revealed the answer before anyone said a word. Families gradually began recommending her to friends and relatives. They didn't describe her as the realtor who sold them a house. They described her as the realtor who understood what their family truly needed. One Saturday afternoon, Summer spent nearly the entire day showing houses to a young couple expecting their first child. By sunset, they had toured 6 different properties, yet neither of them looked excited. As they walked back to the driveway, the husband smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry we took up your whole day." Summer shook her head. "You don't owe me an apology. We still haven't found the right one." "Then we keep looking." The couple looked at each other, surprised by her answer. Most agents had already tried convincing them to compromise. Summer never did. A few days later, a new listing appeared on the market. She called them immediately and arranged another showing. The house wasn't the biggest they had visited. It wasn't the newest either. But the moment they stepped inside, everything changed. The wife walked into the kitchen, then stood quietly looking through the window toward the backyard. Her husband wandered into the dining room and rested his hand on the table. "My parents would love coming here every Sunday," his wife smiled. "And I can already picture our daughter running around outside." Neither of them mentioned the square footage or the upgrades. They were already imagining the life they could build there. Standing a few steps behind them, Summer finally understood what she had been searching for ever since she entered real estate. Families weren't looking for the perfect house. They were looking for the place where their future would unfold. From that day forward, she stopped measuring success by the number of homes she sold. She measured it by how many families she helped feel certain they had found where they belonged. Summer's career didn't change because of one lucky sale or one wealthy client. It grew one family at a time. The young couple expecting their first child recommended her to the husband's sister when she began searching for her own home. A retired couple she helped move closer to their grandchildren later introduced her to several longtime friends. One satisfied client quietly became 2, then 5, then 10. Summer never asked anyone for referrals. People simply remembered how she made them feel. She never rushed them into making an offer. She never disappeared after closing day. Even months later, if a client had a question about a contractor, a property tax notice, or a repair, Summer answered the phone as though the sale had happened yesterday. Little by little, her calendar filled. Weekends disappeared into open houses and property tours. Evenings were spent reviewing contracts instead of watching television. The workload became heavier every year, yet she refused to change the way she treated people. Every family deserved the same patience she had given her very first client. That belief slowly became the foundation of her reputation across San Diego. One Saturday afternoon, Summer showed a beautiful home to a family relocating from Northern California. The house checked almost every box on their list: spacious kitchen, quiet neighborhood, large backyard. By the end of the tour, the buyers were ready to write an offer. Before they left, Summer asked if they could spend another few minutes walking around the property. She pointed toward several stains near the ceiling that had recently been painted over. Then she showed them signs of an older air conditioning system nearing the end of its lifespan. Finally, she explained that the elementary school assigned to the neighborhood had recently fallen in state rankings, something they had specifically told her was important to their children. The husband looked surprised. "You know, if you hadn't mentioned any of that, we probably would have bought this house today," Summer smiled. "I know." His wife looked at her with genuine curiosity. "Then why tell us?" Summer answered without hesitation. "Because I'd rather lose one commission than help your family buy the wrong home." They thanked her and decided not to make an offer. A few months later, the same couple called again. This time they had found another property they loved, and they wanted only one realtor representing them. Before signing the paperwork, the husband smiled and said, "The day you talked us out of buying that first house was the day we knew we could trust you." Years passed, and Summer's business continued growing, but not because she advertised more than anyone else. Most of her new clients came from people she had helped years earlier. Parents recommended her to their children. Former buyers introduced her to coworkers. One satisfied family quietly led to another. As her schedule became busier, she realized she no longer needed to convince people to work with her. They were already calling because someone they trusted had spoken highly of her. That reputation also gave her something she had never expected: the freedom to choose the kind of realtor she wanted to be. If a client wanted to pressure an elderly homeowner into accepting an unfair offer, Summer politely declined the business. If an investor expected her to hide problems from a buyer, she refused before the first showing was ever scheduled. Walking away from easy commissions never bothered her. Losing money was temporary. Losing trust could take years to repair. By the time she turned 27, Summer had built more than a successful career. She had built a name people believed in, and that trust would soon open the door to the one opportunity she had been waiting for since she was 15. Even after becoming one of the busiest realtors in the city, Summer never lost sight of one particular property. She kept the address saved in her records and checked its status every few months. Whenever public records were updated, she read through them carefully. She reviewed property tax assessments, tracked ownership records, and compared recent sales throughout the neighborhood to understand how the home's value was changing over time. When building permits were filed, she looked up what had been renovated: a new roof, updated plumbing, fresh exterior paint. Every change became another note in the folder she had quietly built over the years. She wasn't collecting information out of curiosity anymore. She was preparing for the day the house might finally return to the market. If that opportunity ever came, she didn't want to waste time researching the property after everyone else had already noticed it. She wanted to know its value before the first buyer even scheduled a showing. 12 years had passed, but she never stopped believing that one day the front door she walked away from would open for her again. 12 years had passed since the day Summer's family loaded the last cardboard box onto a moving truck and drove away from the only home she had ever known. The 15-year-old girl who had promised her father she would take care of Nova was now 27. She had built a career people respected, paid off every debt Morgan had left behind, and given her mother a comfortable life again. Nova no longer worked 2 jobs. Most evenings, the two of them shared dinner together instead of rushing out the door to another shift. Life had finally become peaceful. One evening, they sat on the small patio outside their home, drinking tea as they often did. Nova looked at her daughter for a long moment before smiling. "Your dad would be proud of you." Summer lowered her eyes and smiled softly. "I hope so." Just then, her phone vibrated on the table. It was one of the market alerts she had created years earlier. She picked it up almost absent-mindedly, expecting another routine notification. The moment she saw the address on the screen, her hand stopped moving. It was the house. The listing had gone live only minutes earlier. Summer opened it immediately and read every line without rushing. The asking price, the photographs, the recent improvements. Nothing caught her by surprise because she already knew almost everything about the property. She closed the listing, looked across at Nova, and smiled. "Mom." Nova sensed something in her daughter's voice before she even asked the question. "What happened?" Summer turned the phone so her mother could see the address on the screen. "It's finally for sale." Nova stared at the display for several seconds before looking back at her daughter. Neither of them spoke. After 12 years of waiting, the opportunity they had imagined so many times had finally arrived. While Summer spent 12 years rebuilding her life one step at a time, another family was living a very different story. Harry had gradually stepped back from running his lighting company, leaving more responsibility to his management team. Most of his attention was now focused on his only son, William. After graduating from college, William launched an AI and cryptocurrency startup that quickly attracted investors. The company expanded at an astonishing pace. Funding rounds closed one after another. Business magazines featured William as one of California's most promising young entrepreneurs. Interviews praised his ambition, his vision, and his willingness to move faster than everyone else. Harry couldn't have been prouder. Whenever people congratulated him, he smiled and replied that William's best years were still ahead of him. Watching his son's success reminded him of Morgan years earlier, except this time he believed the ending would be different. William wasn't just making money. He was building a fortune that Harry believed would secure their family's future for generations. Rapid success encouraged William to grow even faster. He hired aggressively, expanded into new markets, and poured money into projects that promised extraordinary returns. Investors continued supporting every decision because the company seemed unstoppable. Then the market changed. Funding became harder to secure. Several major projects failed to generate the revenue the company had projected. Cash reserves began disappearing much faster than expected. William believed the slowdown was temporary. Instead of reducing expenses, he borrowed more money and continued expanding, convinced the next breakthrough would solve everything. It never came. Within months, creditors demanded repayment. Investors withdrew their support. Banks froze additional financing. The company entered bankruptcy proceedings, leaving behind nearly $2 million in debt. Harry spent weeks meeting with lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors, searching for any way to protect his son. One asset after another was sold. Investment accounts disappeared first. Commercial property followed. Company equipment was auctioned off. Every sale reduced the debt, but never enough. Eventually, Harry opened the final financial report and stared at the list of assets that remained. Only one property still carried enough value to make a meaningful difference: the house. He quietly closed the folder and looked around the living room. For 12 years, he had walked through these rooms believing they were simply part of his investment portfolio. Somewhere along the way, without realizing it, the house had become his home too. Harry barely slept that night. Before sunrise, he walked slowly through every room in the house. The living room where William had celebrated major business milestones. The dining room where family dinners had been held over the years. Finally, he stepped into the backyard and stopped beneath the pergola. He had never built it, but after living there for 12 years, the place had quietly become part of his own life. He rested one hand against the weathered wooden post and looked across the yard in silence. Somewhere along the way, the house had stopped being an investment and become his home. But sentiment couldn't erase $2 million in debt. By morning, Harry had made his decision. He called his attorney first, then he called a realtor. I need to sell the house. The paperwork was prepared that afternoon. Harry signed every document without asking a single question. After the realtor left, he remained alone at the dining table, staring at the signed papers in front of him. 12 years earlier, Morgan had sold the house because he wanted to protect his family. Today, Harry was doing exactly the same thing. A few days later, the property officially appeared on the market. Less than an hour after the listing went live, Summer received a notification on her phone. She had created that market alert years ago and never removed it. The moment she saw the address, she opened the listing without hesitation. There was no excitement, no disbelief, only complete focus. She carefully reviewed every photograph, every detail, and every line of the description before opening another folder on her laptop. Inside were 12 years of records she had collected herself. Property tax history, ownership records, building permits, comparable sales, market trends. She compared the asking price against every recent sale in the neighborhood, reviewed the improvements made over the years, and calculated the property's current market value. When she finished, she closed the laptop with complete confidence. The house was worth about $1.1 million, not $1.3 million. She picked up her phone and called Nova. "Everything okay?" Nova asked as soon as she answered. Summer smiled. "I've been waiting 12 years to make this phone call." There was a brief silence before she continued. "The house is finally for sale." Nova didn't speak for several seconds. "Are we really doing this?" Summer looked once more at the address displayed on her screen. "I've been getting ready for this day for half my life." That afternoon, she contacted the listing agent and scheduled a private showing. She didn't need to visit the house to decide whether she wanted it. She had already made that decision 12 years ago. This time, she would walk through the front door as the buyer. The morning of the showing, Summer arrived a few minutes early. She parked across the street and sat quietly behind the steering wheel, looking at the house she had imagined thousands of times over the past 12 years. The white exterior had been repainted. The front yard looked different. Several trees had grown much taller. Time had left its mark, yet she recognized the house immediately. Nova reached over and gently held her daughter's hand. "Ready?" Summer nodded. "I've been ready for a long time." They walked up the driveway together as the listing agent opened the front door. "Take your time," he said before stepping aside. Summer thanked him and slowly crossed the threshold. She wasn't looking at the new flooring or the fresh paint. She wasn't judging the renovations or calculating resale value. Every room reminded her of a memory. The living room where Morgan used to read the newspaper on Sunday mornings. The dining room where they celebrated birthdays. The hallway she used to race through after school. She followed the familiar staircase to the second floor almost without thinking. Her feet remembered the way long before her mind did. Nova stayed downstairs, giving her daughter a few quiet moments alone. Summer stopped outside the bedroom that had once been hers and slowly pushed the door open. The room looked completely different now, but she wasn't searching for the furniture that had disappeared years ago. She was looking for one small detail that almost no one else knew existed. She walked toward the corner of the room and knelt beside the wall. Her fingers brushed across the wood until they stopped. A small heart was still there. Beneath it were 3 letters carved by a little girl and her father many years earlier. Meters S.N. Morgan, Summer, Nova. The mark had survived 12 years without anyone sanding it away or painting over it. Summer smiled through the tears gathering in her eyes. She gently traced the carving with her fingertips before standing up again. She took one last look around the room, then walked back downstairs. This wasn't the moment to come home. That moment would arrive after the house truly belonged to them again. Today was simply the first step toward keeping the promise she had made to her father. Summer returned to the house a few days later for the negotiation. This time, Harry was already waiting inside. 12 years had changed both of them. Summer was no longer the 15-year-old girl who had watched her family leave with a moving truck. Harry no longer carried the confidence of a businessman who always seemed to be in control. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Harry was the first to break the silence. "It's been a long time," Summer nodded politely. "It has." Harry looked at her for a moment before saying, "You've done well for yourself." "I've been fortunate to work with a lot of good people." There was no bitterness in her voice, no sarcasm. She answered with the same calm professionalism she showed every client. Harry noticed it immediately. He had expected resentment. Instead, He was sitting across from a woman who carried herself with quiet confidence. After a few minutes, they sat down at the dining table where the negotiation would begin. Harry slid the paperwork across the table. "I'm asking $1.3 million. Summer looked at the number before opening the folder she had brought with her. It contained market reports, comparable sales, appraisal estimates, and every piece of information she had gathered over the past 12 years. She placed several documents on the table one by one. "These are the 6 most comparable sales within the neighborhood over the past year." Harry listened without interrupting. Summer continued. "The renovations increased the value, but not by $200,000 above market." Harry pointed out the upgrades made to the property over the years. Summer acknowledged every one of them. Then she showed repair records, permit history, and recent appraisal data supporting her own valuation. The discussion remained calm from beginning to end. Neither of them raised their voice. Neither tried to pressure the other. They simply presented facts. After nearly an hour, Harry leaned back in his chair and looked at the documents spread across the table. He knew Summer hadn't come relying on emotion. She had come prepared. Every number she presented could be verified. Every conclusion was supported by evidence. For the first time since the negotiation began, Harry realized he wasn't sitting across from Morgan's daughter anymore. He was sitting across from one of the most respected realtors in San Diego. Neither Summer nor Harry tried to force the negotiation any further. After reviewing every document, Harry closed the folder and looked across the table. "Then let's let the bank decide," Summer nodded. "That's fair." An independent appraisal was ordered the following day. While they waited, Summer returned to work as though nothing had happened. She continued showing houses, meeting clients, and reviewing contracts. She refused to let herself think about the outcome before the report arrived. A week later, both parties received the appraisal at nearly the same time. Harry opened the document and turned directly to the final page. The market value had been determined at $1.1 million. He read the number again before setting the report down. It matched almost exactly what Summer had calculated before the negotiation even began. A short time later, Harry called his attorney. "We'll accept the appraisal." When Summer received the call from her agent, she simply thanked him and began preparing for closing. She didn't celebrate. There was still one final step left before the house could truly become home again. Closing day arrived quietly. Attorneys reviewed the paperwork one final time while the title officer explained the last signatures required before ownership could be transferred. Harry signed first. Then the documents were passed across the table to Summer. Before picking up the pen, she looked toward the settlement statement. "I'd like to change one number." The room grew quiet. The closing officer looked at her with a puzzled expression. "What would you like to change?" Summer looked toward Harry before answering. "The purchase price." Everyone around the table paused. "The appraisal came back at $1.1 million, the attorney said. "That's correct," Summer replied. "But I'd like to pay $1,112,000. Harry frowned slightly. "Why would you pay more?" Summer held his gaze for a moment before speaking. $1,000. She paused briefly. "For every year you kept my home for me." No one said another word. Harry lowered his eyes to the settlement statement. He remained still for several seconds before reaching for his pen again. Without adding another comment, he signed the final page. A few moments later, Summer signed hers. After 12 years, the house officially belonged to her family once again. The closing was complete. The keys no longer belonged to Harry, yet he didn't leave right away. After everyone else stepped outside, he remained standing alone in the empty living room. The silence felt unfamiliar. For 12 years, every holiday, every family dinner, and every conversation with William had happened within those walls. He slowly walked through the house one final time, touching nothing as he moved from room to room. Eventually, he stepped into the backyard. The pergola still stood exactly where it had the day he bought the property. Harry walked beneath it and rested his hand against one of the wooden posts. A faint smile crossed his face, though it carried more reluctance than joy. "You held up pretty well," he murmured to himself. He looked across the yard for another moment before turning back toward the house. The last box was still waiting beside the back door. He picked it up, carried it to his car, and placed it in the trunk. As he reached for the driver's door, something made him stop. He turned around one final time and looked at the house standing quietly behind him. He had bought it as part of a business deal, but somewhere over the years it had become home. Harry let out a slow breath, forced a small smile that never quite reached his eyes, then gave the house one final nod. Without another word, he got into the car and drove away, leaving the home behind for the family that had never truly stopped waiting for it. Not long after Harry left, another car pulled into the driveway. Summer stepped out first, then walked around to open the passenger door for Nova. Neither of them hurried toward the entrance. They simply stood there, looking at the home they had spent 12 years trying to return to. Summer reached for her mother's hand. Together, they walked toward the front door. The key turned smoothly in the lock. As the door opened, neither of them spoke. They stepped inside, side by side. The furniture was gone. The rooms echoed softly with every footstep. Fresh paint covered the walls, and several renovations had changed the appearance of the house. Even so, neither of them felt lost. Home wasn't something they needed to recognize. It was something they had carried with them all those years. Summer looked around the living room before quietly saying, "Welcome home, Mom." Nova smiled through her tears and gently squeezed her daughter's hand. They had finally come back. After a few quiet moments in the living room, Summer let go of her mother's hand. "I'll be right back," Nova nodded, already knowing where her daughter was going. Summer walked toward the staircase, climbed to the second floor, and stopped outside the bedroom that had once been hers. She slowly pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty now. Fresh paint covered the walls. The floor had been replaced years earlier. Almost everything had changed. She crossed the room without hesitation and knelt beside the same corner she had searched during the showing. Her fingertips brushed lightly across the wood until they found it. The small heart was still there. Beneath it were the 3 letters she and Morgan had carved together when she was little. Meters SN Morgan, Summer, Nova. She gently traced each letter with her fingers as tears rolled silently down her face. For 12 years, she had worried that someone might sand it away during a renovation. That one small piece of her childhood had survived. Summer looked up toward the ceiling and smiled. "Dad." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Mom and I are home." She paused for a moment before continuing. "You don't have to worry anymore." She remained there for another few seconds, her hand still resting on the carving. Then she stood, wiped the tears from her face, and walked back downstairs. Nova was waiting near the front window. Summer smiled as she reached her mother. Neither of them needed to say anything else. The promise Morgan had left unfinished 12 years earlier had finally been fulfilled. The next morning, Summer and Nova returned with a notebook, a measuring tape, and a few photographs they had managed to keep from the old house. Neither of them talked about remodeling the kitchen or replacing the floors. Instead, they walked straight through the house and into the backyard. The pergola still stood where Morgan had built it years ago. Time had faded the stain on the wood, but the structure remained solid. Summer rested her hand against one of the posts and smiled. Dad really built this to last. Nova looked around the yard. The flower beds Morgan had once cared for had long since disappeared beneath new landscaping. Summer slowly pointed to different corners of the garden. The roses were here. She took a few steps to the left. The lavender was over there. Then she looked toward the fence. And the daisies lined this side. Nova looked at her daughter with a gentle smile. "You still remember all of it?" Summer nodded without taking her eyes off the garden. "I remember everything." The two of them unfolded the old photographs on a small patio table and compared them with the backyard in front of them. They weren't trying to create something new. They were trying to bring back the garden Morgan had loved. By the time the sun began setting, the notebook was filled with sketches showing where every flower would be planted again. They looked around the quiet backyard one more time before heading inside. Tomorrow, they would begin putting life back into the garden. The following morning, a delivery truck stopped in front of the house, carrying trays of young flowers, bags of fresh soil, and a few new gardening tools. Summer and Nova carried everything into the backyard together before setting the plants beside the empty flower beds. Summer picked up a shovel and knelt in the same spot where Morgan had once taught her how to plant her very first flower. She loosened the soil carefully, just as he had shown her years ago. Nova handed her a young rosebush. "Not too tight," she said with a gentle smile. Summer looked up and laughed. "Dad used to say that every single time." She spread the roots, lowered the plant into the ground, and covered it with soil. Then the two of them moved on to the next flower bed. One rose after another found its place. Lavender returned beside the walkway. Daisies stretched along the fence exactly where they had once bloomed years before. Neither of them hurried. They stopped now and then to compare the old photographs with the garden in front of them, adjusting the position of each plant until it matched the memories they both carried. By late afternoon, the backyard no longer looked empty. Summer set the watering can beside the first row of roses and slowly watered each flower while Nova gathered the remaining gardening tools. When everything was finished, the two of them walked beneath the pergola and looked across the garden in silence. The breeze drifted through the flowers just as it had all those years ago. This time, neither of them needed to promise they would come back. They already had.